Herbin lied about cancer to avoid responsibility. Now I find out he's cheating on me with at least 3 women. What would you do if you found out your husband was cheating? Not with one, but with at least 3 other women. Panic, disappointment, disgust. I even wanted to kill him. After all these years of living together, I never expected my life to unfold this way. I thought I had everything figured out. A partner I trusted, a beautiful home, and a baby on the way. But the man I thought I knew turned out to be someone else entirely. Let me start from the beginning. When I met Luke, I was immediately drawn to him. He was kind, charming, and seemed to have it all together. We hit it off quickly, and before long, we were a couple. Everything was moving smoothly until one day, out of nowhere, he dropped a bombshell. He told me that he had been diagnosed with cancer. At first, I was in shock. He explained that his condition was serious and that if his surgery didn't go well, it could be terminal. He was calm about it, as if he had already come to terms with his fate. But I remember feeling this deep, unsettling mix of sadness and disbelief. How could someone so young, someone I had just fallen for, be facing such a grim future? I tried to be supportive. He told me that his treatments might leave him infertile, which devastated me at the time. We were just starting out in our relationship, and I had always wanted children. But as I watched him go through the grueling treatments, I pushed my own fears aside. I was there for him through the long hospital stays, the rounds of chemotherapy, and the endless doctor visits. I even researched his condition, determined to understand what he was going through so I could help him fight this invisible enemy. During this time, I also found out that I was pregnant. It was unexpected, but I couldn't have been more thrilled. Luke seemed excited too, at least. That's what I thought. He had always told me how much he wanted a family, and I believed that we could make it work, no matter what challenges we faced. He promised me that once he got through the surgery and the treatments, everything would return to normal. He'd be there for me, for the baby, and we'd have a long, happy life ahead of us. But things weren't as they seemed. Throughout my pregnancy, I became increasingly suspicious of Luke. There were small things at first. Moments when he'd act distant, or make excuses for why he couldn't come over. I brushed them off as stress or fatigue from his treatments, but deep down, I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I should have trusted that feeling. Luke was living with his mom while recovering from surgery. I was trying to balance taking care of myself and the baby while he was in recovery. It was hard. Pregnancy was difficult, and it felt incredibly lonely. I was dealing with the physical and emotional toll of carrying our child, and on top of that, I was taking on more responsibility for his well-being. But I kept pushing through because I believed that he needed me, that we needed each other. We still spent time together, of course. He'd come to my house, and we'd visit his mom's, making sure our baby knew who her dad was. Every Wednesday, he had Daddy-Daughter Day, where he'd bond with our little one. Even though I was the one doing most of the work, still, I cherished those moments, and I thought they meant something to him. I thought they were the foundation of a beautiful future. But again, I was wrong. One Wednesday, everything changed. I was home alone with the baby when I received a call from my neighbor. There had been an attempted break-in at my house. I was terrified. I felt like everything was unraveling around me. I immediately called Luke, asking him to come over. I needed someone there, someone I could trust, but he refused. He said he couldn't leave his mom's house. I didn't understand. The panic, the fear, it all hit me at once, and I was left alone to deal with it. I couldn't stop thinking about how strange his behavior had been. He wasn't there for me when I needed him the most. When I talked to his mom, she casually mentioned that Luke wasn't even home. I was taken aback, but something inside me clicked. I knew something wasn't right. I had been making excuses for him for so long, but this was different. It felt like a betrayal. That night, after hours of arguing and crying, I decided to do something I should have done long before. I checked his social media. It took me less than an hour to uncover the first 2 women he had been seeing during my pregnancy. I was devastated and furious. How could he do this to me? To our baby? The man I had been supporting, loving, and trusting had been lying to me this entire time. I confronted him immediately, but I didn't want to do it in person. I wanted to make sure I had all the evidence I needed to prove that I wasn't crazy. I sent him a message, telling him I knew about the affairs, and that I didn't want him anywhere near our home. The locks were changed, so he couldn't get in. I told him I was done. His reaction was exactly what I expected. He panicked. He begged me to let him explain. He wanted to come over, but I refused. I had finally seen through his lies. I didn't need to hear his excuses anymore. I didn't stop there. While I waited for his response, I found a photo on one of his new girlfriend's social media pages. A photo of her and Luke together. I shared it on my own page, with the caption, "Can someone please ask this woman to contact me?" I had to let her know the truth. She immediately blocked me, but her sister reached out. She wasn't surprised. She told me that her family had always been wary of Luke, and now they could see why. I sent her the birth certificate and a picture of me with Luke in the hospital, hoping to show her that I wasn't just some crazy ex-girlfriend. I wanted her to know the reality of the situation. During this time, another woman reached out to me, furious about what Luke had done to her. She, too, had been lied to. She had no idea about me or any of the other women. As more and more women came forward, I started piecing together a timeline of his deceit. He had been lying to everyone about his cancer, about his infertility, and about his supposed dedication to getting better. But the worst part was that he wasn't just lying about his health. He had been using his fake illness as a way to manipulate everyone around him, including me. And the entire time, he was having affairs with multiple women, including the one he had left me for. I felt like my world was crumbling, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him get away with this. As I began piecing together the chaos Luke had created, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. I thought I had been living in a shared reality with him, building a future, a family. But the truth, the one that had been hiding in plain sight all along, was something so much darker. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. But I also knew that I wasn't the only one he'd deceived. Once the first woman reached out to me, I felt like I couldn't stop. I had to know everything. Who else had he hurt? How long had this been going on? What else had he lied about? The more I dug, the more horrifying the revelations became. The woman who contacted me was heartbroken, just like I was. She had been seeing Luke for months, unaware of me or any of the other women. She told me that he had told her the same story. "I have cancer. I can't get you pregnant. I'm infertile." The same lines he had used on me. It was all a web of lies to get women to trust him, to lower their defenses so he could sleep with them without consequence. The lies about infertility, about cancer, about being a broken man, they were all just part of his manipulation. One thing stood out. Luke's behavior had always been inconsistent. Sometimes, he would be the perfect partner, caring and attentive, especially when he knew he needed to maintain the illusion. Other times, he'd disappear, making vague excuses about needing time for his recovery. But what was he recovering from? His cancer? Or the guilt of his own actions? I was starting to see the truth. As I continued gathering information, I started to put together a timeline of his lies and affairs. He had claimed he was in remission, and I had believed him, though I had my suspicions. What I learned was that he wasn't fighting cancer at all. He had been undergoing treatment for a serious autoimmune disorder, but it wasn't terminal. His mom, when I confronted her, confirmed this. But even worse, he had been using that illness as a shield to cover up his infidelity and drug abuse. I felt a wave of nausea hit me when I learned that he had been in rehab. His mother had inadvertently mentioned it during a conversation, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Luke had been using cocaine, and all this time, I had been thinking he was a man who was trying to survive cancer, doing everything he could to get better for me and our baby. Instead, he had been hiding his addiction, lying about his condition, and living a double life. I had trusted him. I had cared for him through treatments I believed were saving his life. But instead, I had been supporting a man who was lying about everything. Not just about his health, but about his life, his relationships, and his priorities. The final straw came during the most painful moment of my life. When I went into labor, things didn't go as planned. I was rushed to the hospital after having complications, and I was terrified. The doctors were scrambling to help me, and I felt like I was slipping away. Our daughter was in distress, and they needed to act quickly. I was being prepped for emergency surgery when I realized that Luke wasn't there. I thought maybe he was on his way, but I later found out that while I was in agony, fighting for my life and our babies, he was with one of his other girlfriends. I couldn't believe it. I felt my heart shatter. The man who promised to be there for me, who had told me he would stand by my side no matter what, had abandoned me at the most critical moment. I was in so much pain, physically and emotionally, that I couldn't process it at the time. But once I recovered and everything settled, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How could he do that to me? How could he have been with her, knowing I was in the hospital, in labor, about to undergo surgery? It felt like the ultimate betrayal, and I couldn't keep quiet about it anymore. I had to expose him. I turned to social media. I had already posted the photo of him and his new girlfriend, hoping to get her to contact me. But now I was going further. I started posting everything: screenshots, text messages, medical records, the timeline I had painstakingly put together. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I wasn't going to let him continue to manipulate me and everyone else. The reaction was overwhelming. Some people believed me, others didn't. But I didn't care. I knew what I had lived through, and I knew what he had done. The more I exposed, the more people started coming forward. His exes, his friends, even people I hadn't met before. They all shared their stories of how Luke had manipulated them, lied to them, and used them. It felt like a dam had broken, and I couldn't stop it. Luke's response was exactly what I expected. He denied everything. He tried to manipulate me, make me feel crazy, like I was imagining things or making up stories. He told his new girlfriend that I was a psycho stalker and that I was just bitter. He kept insisting that everything I was posting was a lie, but it wasn't, and I had the proof to show it. I didn't back down, though. I couldn't. I had a responsibility not just to myself, but to all the women he had hurt. I had to make sure they knew the truth. I sent messages to each of his exes, each of the women he had been involved with, warning them. I sent them the screenshots of his lies, the medical evidence, and the timeline of his affairs. I wanted them to know that they weren't crazy. They weren't the problem. He was. He had manipulated us all. Through all of this, I kept thinking about my daughter. The one thing that kept me going was knowing that I had to protect her. I had to protect her from a man who couldn't be trusted, a man who had already shown his true colors. And I couldn't let him continue to be a part of her life if he wasn't going to be honest and responsible. I was done being gaslighted. I was done living in a fantasy world where he was the perfect partner, the perfect father. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. The next steps were unclear. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him continue to lie and manipulate. Not anymore. It didn't take long for the backlash to hit. Once I started sharing the evidence, Luke tried to keep his cool, but the cracks were starting to show. I could see through his lies, and it felt like the walls were closing in on him. He didn't just hurt me, he hurt everyone who had ever trusted him. His family, his friends, the women he'd slept with, they all saw his true face now. His reaction was predictably defensive. He tried to flip the script, turning me into the villain. He sent me angry texts, calling me crazy and obsessive. He said I was destroying his life and that I had no right to share our private business with the world. But I wasn't destroying anything. I was exposing the truth, and it had to be done. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was protecting every woman he had lied to, every woman he had used. I started hearing from more of his exes, each one with a story of their own. Some were angry, others were heartbroken, but all of them were devastated in one way or another by Luke's manipulation. They had all been fed the same lies: the cancer story, the infertility claim, the desperate attempts to make them feel like they were special, when in reality, they were just another notch on his belt. It was surreal hearing how many people had been affected by his actions. I felt the weight of it. The guilt started creeping in. Guilt for not knowing sooner. Guilt for not protecting myself and my daughter better. But then I reminded myself, I couldn't have known. He was good at hiding things and making everything look normal on the surface. And honestly, I couldn't have expected this level of deceit. The most jarring moment came when I found out that Luke had been lying to his own mother. He had told her that I was the one who was unstable, that I was the one causing all the drama, and she, blindly defending him, had believed him. It hurt so much to realize that he had been playing both sides against each other this whole time. I had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. But that's when I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep fighting in this toxic cycle. I had to step away from it. For my own mental health, and for the sake of my daughter, the more I fought with him, the more tangled in his lies I became. I had to let the truth do the work. I couldn't save everyone, but I could save myself and my child. As I started to pull back, things began to shift. The people who had once been by his side started questioning him. His friends, who had covered for him and stood by his side all this time, were now beginning to see the cracks in his story. Some reached out to apologize to me. Some even started sharing their own stories of how they had been lied to by him. I could feel the tide turning. Meanwhile, I was making plans for the future. I couldn't keep living in the same house, in the same environment where all of this had unfolded. It wasn't just about Luke anymore. It was about creating a safe, stable place for my daughter. I started reaching out to friends and family for support, asking them to help me find resources to rebuild my life. But even with everything falling apart around me, I couldn't ignore the one constant, my daughter. She was still a tiny little thing, only a few months old, but she was my anchor. I was her mother, and I was going to give her the best possible life, one where she didn't have to know the details of her father's lies, one where she wouldn't have to suffer because of his choices. I didn't know how long it would take to fully heal from all of this, or what kind of future I would have now that everything had been laid bare. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let him destroy me. I wasn't going to let him take away my peace, my sense of self. The truth had come out, and it was messy, painful, and devastating. But now, I was ready to move on. For me, for my daughter, and for all the other women he had hurt along the way. I wasn't going to let him take any more from me. As the dust settled, the full extent of everything Luke had done was becoming clear. I had thought I'd hit rock bottom when I learned about his affairs, the lies, the manipulation, but I soon realized that the real challenge was just beginning. The more people I talked to, the more I discovered just how deep his web of deceit ran. His friends, his family, they had all been complicit in turning a blind eye. No one had questioned his behavior until it all came crashing down. The first real blow came when I had to face his family. His mother, who had been one of the only people I had trusted in all this, was devastated. She had believed every lie Luke had told her about me, that I was the one who was crazy, paranoid, and unstable. To make matters worse, she had been helping him cover up his behavior, giving him a place to stay while he was supposedly recovering from his addiction. When she found out the truth, I could see the pain in her eyes. She was a mother, and she wanted to believe that her son wasn't capable of the things he had done, but she couldn't deny it anymore. It was hard for me too. I had once seen her as a mother figure, someone I could lean on, but now I felt betrayed. She had known about his addiction, about his behavior, but she had never said a word. Instead, she allowed me to believe his cancer story, supported his lies, and kept everything hidden. It felt like another layer of betrayal, and it stung. I didn't want to harbor anger toward her, though. I knew she was a victim of his manipulation, too. She had been just as blind as I had, but I had to draw a line. I couldn't keep allowing myself to be swept up in the confusion of his lies. I couldn't continue to make excuses for people who had been complicit in hurting me, in hurting my daughter. For a while, I considered cutting off all ties with Luke's family. It was tempting. After everything that had happened, I felt like there was no need for me to stay connected to any of them. But then I thought about my daughter. She needed to have a relationship with her grandparents, her aunts, her uncles, even if they didn't all know the full story. So instead of cutting ties entirely, I chose to set boundaries. I made it clear that I was no longer willing to participate in the lies, and I wasn't going to be the scapegoat for his mistakes. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right choice. For my daughter, for me, I wasn't going to let my life be dictated by the dysfunction he had created. It was time to take control of my own narrative, to move forward with clarity. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding myself. The first thing I did was take a step back from social media. I had spent so much time exposing the truth, and while it felt cathartic, I knew I needed to give myself a break. I had already shared what needed to be shared. The rest was out of my hands. The judgment, the opinions, the accusations from his friends and family, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was my healing and my daughter's future. I reached out to a counselor, someone who could help me process everything I had been through. Talking to someone who wasn't emotionally involved in my situation gave me a fresh perspective. It wasn't just about moving on from Luke's betrayal. It was about reclaiming my own sense of self. I had spent so many months, even years, trying to make sense of his behavior, trying to fix things, trying to be the perfect partner for someone who didn't deserve it. But now, I am focusing on myself. In therapy, I began to explore the patterns of behavior that had led me into this toxic relationship in the first place. I didn't blame myself. I was a victim of his manipulation, of course, but I did recognize that I had ignored red flags. I had been so focused on building a life with him, so focused on the future we were going to have, that I ignored my gut feeling. I had silenced my intuition, allowing myself to believe the lies he told me, because I wanted so badly to believe in the dream of us as a family. It was hard to accept that, but I did. And slowly, I began to rebuild a sense of worth. I wasn't just the woman who had been betrayed, I was a mother, a person with hopes, dreams, and a future ahead of me. I started to think about what kind of life I wanted for my daughter. What did I want her to see in me? What did I want her to learn from the way I handled this situation? The answer was simple. I wanted her to see strength. I wanted her to see someone who didn't give up, someone who stood up for herself, who stood up for the people she loved. I wanted her to grow up knowing that no one, not even her father, had the right to manipulate, abuse, or control her. I also started making plans for my future. I wasn't going to let Luke's presence in my life define me anymore. I began to look at the house we had been planning to move into and decided to start fresh. I didn't need him there. I didn't need to hold on to the life we had once envisioned. I could make my own dreams come true without him. I took a deep breath and realized that, for the first time in a long time, I was free. The hardest part, though, was navigating the legal battle that was about to unfold. He wasn't going to let go of me or our daughter easily. He would fight for custody, of course, and he would continue to lie and manipulate his way through the process. But I had proof. I had all the evidence I needed to show the truth, and I was ready to fight for my daughter's safety, her well-being, and our future. But I wasn't going to let fear control me anymore. I had already faced the worst, and I was still standing. Now, I was going to focus on what really mattered: my daughter's happiness, my own healing, and the life we were going to build, free from his lies. The days following the revelations about Luke felt like they were dragging, but at the same time, they were freeing. I no longer had to pretend everything was okay, no longer had to smile and act like the family life we had built together was perfect. It wasn't. And now, I could stop pretending. I had to move forward, but it wasn't easy. The legal battle was coming, and I knew that it was going to get ugly. Luke wasn't going to go down without a fight. But this time, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I had seen the depths of his lies, the manipulation that had stretched for years. He didn't have the power to control me anymore, not like he once did. I had already made my decision. I was going to fight for full custody of our daughter, no matter what. There was no way I was going to let him back into her life, especially after everything I had uncovered. His addiction, the affairs, the lies. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting her. With the help of a lawyer, I began the process of securing custody. The first few meetings were emotionally draining. I had to recount everything: the lies, the betrayal, the way he had manipulated me and put our daughter at risk. But as hard as it was to relive it all, I knew it was necessary. I had to show the court the truth of what kind of man he was. One of the hardest parts of the process was talking to social services. They needed to assess the situation, investigate his behavior, and decide if he posed a risk to our daughter. I knew he would try to charm his way through the process, painting himself as the loving father who just made a few mistakes. But I had the evidence, and I was determined to make sure they saw the reality. I also knew there would be people who doubted me. Luke was charming, manipulative. He could easily convince people he was the victim, that I was just bitter or crazy. His friends and family would rally behind him, no matter what he had done. But I wasn't going to back down. The support I received from other women who had been hurt by him was invaluable. Some of them had been with him long before I was, and they reached out to share their stories, to provide testimonies, to help me prove that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. Luke had a pattern, and he needed to be stopped before he hurt anyone else. It wasn't just about protecting my daughter from him. It was about protecting all the women he had used, all the people he had manipulated, all the lives he had destroyed. If I could stop him from doing this to anyone else, then I had to try. I also knew I had to be strong for my daughter. I couldn't let her see me falter now. The process was stressful, but I refused to let it break me. Every time I thought about how close he had come to destroying our lives, it fueled me. I wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. There were days when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. I had moments of doubt, moments where I wondered if I was making the right decisions. I wasn't perfect, and I had made my own mistakes in the past. But in those moments, I reminded myself why I was doing this. For her. For my daughter, I had to show her that no one, not even her father, had the right to control her, to hurt her, to manipulate her. She needed to know that she could always count on me to protect her, no matter what. The hardest part, though, was knowing that this wasn't just about getting him out of our lives. It was about finding a way to move on. It was about finding a sense of peace again. I wasn't going to let his lies define me. I wasn't going to let his betrayal steal my future or my happiness. It would take time, but I was determined to rebuild my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own story, and that was the most powerful thing of all. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of the battle I was in started to feel more like a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. The custody fight was now a full-blown legal war, and I was still processing all the emotions from everything that had happened. But there was no turning back. I had made my choice, and I was seeing it through. I was no longer a woman on the sidelines, waiting for life to change. I was the one driving this, pushing through the pain, the doubt, the exhaustion. The hardest part was seeing how Luke responded. He still thought he could control the narrative. He still believed he could lie his way out of this. He started telling people I was crazy again, that I was overreacting. He reached out to mutual friends, trying to rally them against me, portraying me as unstable, as someone who had lost touch with reality. He even tried to play the victim card, claiming he was just trying to get better for his daughter. But this time, I didn't care. It didn't matter what he said or who he tried to convince. I knew the truth, and more importantly, I had the evidence to back it up. His manipulation couldn't touch me anymore. Every time he tried to twist the story, I reminded myself of what I had learned over the past few months. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I was someone who had been deceived, someone who had fought to protect her family in the face of unimaginable lies. The custody battle became a long, drawn-out process. The courts were meticulous, taking their time to assess everything, but every time I spoke to my lawyer, I felt a little more reassured. The truth was on my side, and though the legal system sometimes felt like a slow, grinding machine, I knew it would get there. Throughout all of this, I found unexpected strength in the smallest moments. Watching my daughter laugh, watching her learn new things, watching her grow into her own little person, that's what kept me going. She was my reason for everything. Every decision I made, every painful step I took, was for her. I wanted her to grow up in a world where she knew she was safe, loved, and protected. There were moments when I found myself overwhelmed by everything. The constant legal meetings, the endless documents to fill out, the worry over what might happen next. It felt like too much sometimes, but I also started to realize that those moments of weakness didn't define me. They were just moments. And in the bigger picture, they meant nothing compared to the woman I was becoming. I was no longer the woman who had blindly followed Luke, trying to fit into his world. I was no longer the woman who believed his lies, who let him control every aspect of our life. I was someone who had survived, who had learned, and who was building something better for herself and her daughter. The most important thing I realized during this process was that I didn't need Luke anymore. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his presence in my life. I didn't need the fantasy of what I thought our family could be. I had everything I needed right here, in the love and laughter of my daughter, and in the strength I was discovering within myself. Eventually, the court made its decision. Luke didn't get what he wanted. The judge saw through his lies, through his manipulation, and the custody arrangement was finalized in my favor. It wasn't a perfect victory. The scars from everything that had happened would never completely disappear, but it was enough. Enough to know that my daughter was safe, that she would grow up knowing her worth, that I had done everything I could to protect her. As time passed, the pain of betrayal faded, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't angry anymore. I had been. But anger only keeps you chained to the past, and I didn't need that. I didn't need to carry it with me any longer. The future wasn't entirely clear, and I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but I was ready for them. With each passing day, I felt more certain that I was on the right path. I was strong. I was capable. And most importantly, I wasn't alone. The life I was building for my daughter and me was ours. No one could take that from us. It was going to be a life filled with love, growth, and most importantly, freedom. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free, and that freedom was everything.